Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Our analysts are here to go through the 11-12 meta for each stage of the game. We'll be covering each aspect of the meta, including stages, items, and compositions. There's a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To start off with, let's talk about the early game beginning with the opening carousel. Due to the changes introduced in 11-12, the meta favors AP compositions more so than it does AD. This doesn't mean that you have to play AP builds, but a majority of the time you're going to have more options if you aim to play one of them. What this means for priority from the first carousel is you want a component that builds into a usable AP item. At the top priority is going to be Rod. Rod opens up the door for items like Archangel Staff, Death Cap, Jeweled Gauntlet, and most importantly, Shadow Locket. Shadow Locket is one of the best items you can make early game because it adds so many defensive stats to your board that other early game boards are going to have trouble dealing with it. The great thing about Shadow Locket is how universal it is, so playing for it doesn't limit your chances later on in the game. Another component worth considering is Tier. Tiers can be used to make a lot of useful items such as Blue Buff, Redemption, Static Shiv, Archangel Staff, and Hand of Justice. But by far the best use of Tier is when you find a Shadow Tier to pair with it to make Dark Blue Buff. Dark Blue Buff is an essential item on Rise, so having it allows you to comfortably play Rise and likely Forgotten later on in the game. And of course, if you're okay not playing Forgotten, you don't have to make the item since it's really only useful on Rise. Besides Rod and Tier, there's not much priority on the other components. Sword generally lets you make AP items, which are important in the current meta, though it does increase the value of playing champions like Callista or Riven in the early game. Belt can turn into Warmogs to boost your early game frontliners such as Gragas, or you can try to make Morellonomicon or Sunfire Cape to have a bit of healing reduction. Chain Vests and Gloves are on the weaker side of components, but are both still fine. Oak is really the only component you want to try to avoid if possible, though it does have uses like Runa's Hurricane or defensive item like Shadow Stoneplate. It's also used to make Bloodthirster, but that's not really an essential item unless you're for sure running a champion like Draven later. The issue with Cloak is having multiples is generally a waste. Overall, there's plenty of viable items in the meta, but the best options by far come from having a Rod or Tier. Let's move on to Stage 1 of the early game. Stage 1 is mostly about buying pairs and looking for strong board openings. There's a lot of options, but some of the best are Gragas Kha'Zix, Callista Aatrox, Ziggs with Hellion, and Vladimir Lissandra. This is just accounting for the one-cost champion since what you get from your early loot orbs is random. But if you do get a 2 or 3 cost champion, then you have even more options than other players. For example, Yasuo is by far one of the strongest champions in the current meta. Hitting him early from a loot orb can generally put you in a position to win streak through most of stage 2 and 3, putting you in a solid position for the mid game. Riven can create a similar opportunity, though she's overall weaker the later the game goes. In general, most early traits will do well if you have the champions to pair with them. Stick to playing your strongest board unless you're given an obvious direction to take. Now on to stage 2, where a few decisions do need to be made. For the most part, the decision of when to level is easy. Try to level to 4x2-2 and the level to 5x2-5. There's certainly nuance to this, but playing your strongest board generally means you want to stay with the leveling curve of the lobby. That way you're at least near the power level of everyone else and will lose less health. Playing for a loss streak is a viable option, but only do so if you're comfortable being 60 health or less after Krugs. The major decisions to make in Stage 2 are what direction to take your early game board and what items to make. In general, it's best to wait until the 2-2 Armory to use your components so that you'll have more options after seeing what components the Armory has. For example, if you have a regular Chain Vest and a Rod, there's a solid chance the Armory will have a Shadow version of either of those components. Then that allows you to make an early Shadow Locket. There will be openings where you won't have any usable components, though that's mostly from gold openings where you only have 1 or 2 components. For everyone else that has 3 components before the Armory, you really want to make at least 1 item after receiving the Armory component. That will help boost your board's strength to match players that hit a lot of early gold. Some of the best early game items to make are Shadow Locket, Static Shiv, Sunfire Cape, Hand of Justice, Shadow Stoneplate, and Warmogs. That's not to say they're the only items you should make, but having these items boost your board without committing yourself to any one particular composition later on. Overall, defensive items are the best, as you're always going to benefit from having 1 or 2 of them later. As for early game boards, again, the goal is to play your strongest board. This can be redeemed with Varus as an item holder, Nunu and Abomination with any of AD, AP, or defensive items, early Hellions with upgraded Ziggs, or traits like Dawnbringer, Nightbringer, and Legionnaire. There's plenty of options, but try to have an idea of what you're aiming for, as a hodgepodge of champions and traits tends to be weaker than a cohesive early game board. With that, let's move towards the mid game with Stage 3. Stage 3 is in an awkward time in the game because oftentimes half the lobby can skip it and half the lobby has to roll to stabilize. Either way, most players will be leveling to 6 around 3-2, maybe 3-1 if they're on a win streak and want to preserve it. Leveling later is okay if you're already at 50 gold and can slow roll, but again, keep in mind you want to be on a similar leveling curve as the rest of the lobby, as getting behind on that can be detrimental. For any players that did well in Stage 2 and have a naturally strong board in Stage 3, they can basically skip through and aim for rolling on level 7. But for everyone else, if you're feeling weaker than other boards based on what you're scouting, or you're going into Stage 3 on a loss streak and below 60 to 70 health, you will need to roll. The amount you roll depends on how weak your board is, but generally the goal is to stabilize with an item holding carry and a solid front line. This can be a multitude of different things, but play off what items you've made and which ones you can make. It's certainly not going to be the best in slot items for anything, but that's okay. Stabilizing to preserve health is more important than having the perfect items later. Be sure to try not to roll all of your gold so that you have some semblance of an economy, so don't dip below 10 gold. Ideally, you want to still be around 20 gold or more after rolling so you can recover by Stage 4. And with that, we can move into Stage 4. Level! Once it's 4-1, you want to level to 7 or have leveled to 7 already. Win streaking players or those with a lot of gold may have leveled earlier, but the majority of players will want to hit level 7 on 4-1. It's usually a good idea to roll on this stage unless you've been high rolling and have a really strong board with a lot of health. But most players won't be in that position, so roll and look for a 4-cost carry and build your comp around them. Make sure you're scouting prior to 4-1 so you have an idea of what others are playing. Pay close attention to any early 4-cost champions that other players hit, particularly highly contested ones like Karma and Rise. Once you've leveled and rolled, the goal is to save up and play for level 8 sometime in Stage 5. Of course, you may still need to roll for each round if your board is still losing and you weren't able to hit important upgrades. If that's the case, you're likely playing for at best a top 4. One last aspect of Stage 4 is a fast level 8. Some players will be able to do this comfortably because they had a strong Stage 2 and 3, meaning they can level anywhere from 4-3 to 5-1. Other players will take a risk to level without rolling and try to get a lucky 5-cost roll on 8. In any case, the rule of thumb to keep in mind for leveling to 8 early is to have at least 30 gold left if you need to roll and have enough gold to make meaningful upgrades to your board. Before we get into the late game, let's talk about the current meta comps. Most of the meta revolves around vertical traits. There's a few reasons for this. 1, it's easier to play vertical traits because you just need to find 6 of whichever trait you're playing. 2, there's plenty of AP options that your items can flex between most builds. 3, the armory changes from Stage 4 and on have made finding emblems or spatulas a lot easier, making it easier to play vertical traits. As for which vertical traits to play, there's plenty of options. The top 3 are Dawnbringer, Forgotten, and Redeemed. In some cases, you can also run 6 Nightbringer, 6 Legionnaire, or 6 Assassin, but those traits tend to be used as secondary traits to others. Dawnbringer uses Karma as the carry, with Garen being the second most important champion. Forgotten, you really want Shadow Locket or Rise 2 with a dark blue buff. Katarina does well as a mid-game item carry, and Draven should take over for the late game. Redeemed is basically just Vel'Koz since Kayle is played in a different composition, and Varus isn't a great carry past the early game. For all 3 of these compositions, you want 6 of the main traits, though it can certainly vary game to game. Yasuo is also an option, but he's played in a variety of builds such as 4 Nightbringer, 4 Dragonslayer, 4 Nightbringer, 4 Legionnaire, or 6 Nightbringer, 2 Legionnaire. Whichever composition you do play, keep in mind Yasuo needs to be slow rolled for at level 7 if you want to use him as a late game carry. There's a lot of champions that are worth playing in addition to your main comp. Rise is extremely popular since he's a mystic, meaning you can play him in any composition. Same goes for Kindred. Ivern and Volibear are back to being the 2 best frontliners that you can fit well into a lot of compositions. And by far the best standalone champion is Rel, as she's just a really good frontliner. All in all, there's a lot of options in the meta to play for, but by far the most popular are vertical traits. Play one of the 3 traits that's least contested, and generally, you'll be able to top 4 consistently. With that, we can transition into the late game. The late game is about finishing your composition, adding in 5-cost champions when possible, and being diligent about scouting and positioning. Level 9 is still difficult for most players to comfortably hit, so only do so in games where you know your board is close to being capped and you have the golden health to commit to leveling. For everyone else, your board is capping at level 8. Level 8 for most players should be sometime after 5-1, no later than stage 6. Once you hit level 8, you're going to want to keep looking for upgrades to your existing board while adding in useful 5 costs if you can. Garen does well in AP compositions, Volibear pairs with Ivern, Heimerdinger and Teemo can be late game carry transitions if you're unable to find Karma 2 or Vel'Koz 2. Kindred is by far the easiest to fit into any board as they're a Mystic. Scouting and positioning will matter the most from stage 6 and on, so be sure to focus on that for the late game. There's no real advice to give besides moving your board around constantly so you're not remaining static for other players to easily position against. But each composition requires different positioning based on who you're going against and what they're running, so it's difficult to say what's best. Be sure to watch streams to get an idea of how high ELO players position late game. All in all, the late game is heavily influenced by the early and mid game. Improving those aspects will naturally lead to better late game scenarios and more consistent placings. That's not to say you should ignore the late game, but focusing on improving the other parts of the game will help more in the long run. That's going to be it for today's video, folks. Overall, patch 11.12 has been a good one with a diverse meta. The main issues are AD compositions are a bit weaker and the RNG elements of the new armories from stage 4 and on, but those issues are easily fixed in future patches. Let us know in the comments section below what you're looking forward to most in patch 11.13. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.